Well, we're back. It's a whole nother episode of American Hot Rod Association Drag Racing History Channel.
Whee!
I know, woo-wee is right because I love doing this show. It's only been like a week since we started.
Yeah, well, time flies.
I know, time flies when you're having fun.
All right, but...
Well, first off, before we get into the meat and potatoes, we're going to talk about some corrections from the previous one, from the intro video.
We made mistakes.
Well, you know, I'm fallible.
You are fallible. I noticed that right away.
I know.
First thing I picked up on.
Perfect. But what happened was, because we did the intro, we had a lot of people call that were interested, and some of them were literally there, right, to see it happen.
These are like 90, 100-year-old people.
Yeah, Don Wormsley was the AHRA tech director all the way through the end.
Okay.
And I also had a guy named Jim Hall call me from the Golden Commandos. I spoke with Miss Ruth Tice.
Okay.
So we got some of this stuff on track, and they definitely poked me in the eye telling me where we were screwed up.
And are they going to be joining as we go along?
I hope so. I mean, I really hope so. I talked to them about, you know, maybe we can do something like a phone interview with them or whatever, which would be really, really awesome. But and
well, that's the neat thing about drag racing. Okay, so like we're focused on like the glory days, the 60s and the 70s, you know, which is a long time ago.
Right.
So we're fortunate enough at this period of time that a lot of those people are still alive.
Right.
And they can still tell those stories firsthand.
And that's, we got to get them before they go. I mean, because the matter of fact, no one's getting out here alive. And none of them are getting any younger.
Oh, no.
Right? So we got to capitalize on that now, I guess, while we can. So I think the big thing is, the corrections that we got to make is, Jim didn't move the AHRA to Kansas area until he became president in 61. It would have been after he became president in 61. So not directly after, you know, the invention of the association. The other thing was, when we go through the topic of presidents, there was quite a few of them before it got to Jim Tice. Matter of fact, one of them was the man himself, the large daddy.
Garlitz.
Yeah. He was the president of the Association 59.
Ah, okay.
It's the large father, I guess you call him. Right?
I guess that would have to directly to do with the Nitro Man.
No, probably so, because it's right around that same time frame, right? So, but tonight's topic, Slingshot Dragsters.
I love Slingshot Dragsters.
I know you do.
Everybody loves Slingshot Dragsters. You know, the
How can you not? How can you not?
Well, the funny thing about those cars is that even though they've been out of circulation since they've been obsolete for 50 years now.
Right, since 72, right?
To this, well, 71 really, but yeah, 72 or 50 years.
Right.
Even though they've been obsolete for all this time, when people think of a dragster,
that's what they think of. That's the go-to picture.
Exactly. Yeah, you look up dragster in the dictionary, and there's a slingshot, and more specifically, a slingshot from the later era, from the
67
to 71. Right.
Yeah, that's when they were the most beautiful. They had them refined, and they were just dead nuts perfect.
Well, see, there's a lot to do with how the subconscious mind breaks things down too.
Oh, well, tell.
The dragster went through several phases of evolution. So Mickey Thompson was the first to actually drop the driver behind the rear axle, forming the slingshot. Slingshot meaning like it looks like the driver is the rock in the slingshot, right? But in 1963, 1964, Tommy Ivo, working with Ken Fuller, Ivo was very style conscious.
Right.
And he wanted something that was just beautiful.
Right. His look, he always focused on looks.
Yes.
You know, as well as performance, right?
Well, dragsters from that early era, the front engine dragsters from that early era, 60, 61, 62, 63, all had a boxy sort of look. They had that squared off kind of roll cage. They were kind of short wheelbase.
Right, like the Dragmaster chassis kind of.
Right,
okay.
Right. Beautiful in their own way, but not, you know, not that sleek thing. So Ivo, working with Ken Fuller, they came up with a formula that had to do with the headers and the front hoop of the roll cage. And they determined that for the car to have the right look, the headers should be bent back at the same degree as the front of the roll cage.
Oh, so it needs to have like a symmetrical kind of look.
Right.
Okay.
And the car should be narrow and sleek, right? So they started stylizing the car along those lines. It was more aesthetic. It's like the cars had been purely function to that point.
Right.
Now aesthetics started to get involved.
Now we start to throw in some form.
Right. and the body panels started to take on some very organic type of curves to them and everything. So by 65, the Slingshot that we think of as like the quintessential Slingshot
starts to become the animal, right? That we know of.
Well, the subconscious mind actually makes it into a woman.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay, especially the later ones, 1966, 67, because, okay, so picture this now, right?
Right.
Picture a woman laying down, okay,
Okay.
on her elbows, with her legs easy. Outstretched, right. Okay? The wheels, the skinny front wheels, are feet.
Okay.
The frame rails, that section there, is legs. And if you're dealing with a car that doesn't have a body on it, the bikini body,
right.
Well, the fuel tank is knees.
Okay, so like where the cap and stuff is at.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then you've got the taper of the frame rails. So the frame rails taper upward towards the back.
Right.
So
like a thigh.
leg would, exactly.
Right.
And then where the hips and the torso and everything is where you've got your engine and wheels and the headers and the whole
That's
bit.
your high performance lady bits.
That's all your lady bits, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And then, well, I know it sounds crazy, right? But now that I'm describing this to you, look at it and you'll never be able to unsee it. Then you've got the actual roll cage, which forms a curve around the top of the driver's head,
right.
like flowing hair. And now you stick a driver in there with an old school breather mask goggle setup,
right.
And there's an actual face.
Oh, okay.
So the subconscious mind sees the Slingshot Dragster as a feminine form. And if you look at the curvature of the bodies, the way they curve the cowls,
right.
The windscreens, the way everything is swept like that, all very organic, soft curves.
And that's one thing that you do notice is that it becomes more or less I guess an architecture like an aircraft, where it almost flowing seamlessly, especially the early aircraft from like the 40s and 50s, where it's like everything's rounded and curved, right? And now, I can see that.
Now you look at today's nostalgia top fuel cars, and they don't have the same. In fact, they don't even come close.
Right, they don't.
Because those feminine elements that were in place in those earlier cars don't exist. Now you see the frame rails are very wide apart from each other. They don't have that taper. The roll cages are squared off like a funny car cage,
right?
So you don't get the top of the head effect.
They also sit really high in the back, so they can see over the blowers and stuff.
Right, and the wheels are a little bit undersized. The tires are only 12 inches wide on the nostalgia cars.
Right.
So they just lose that
dimension and
proportion, and so that's why if people are going to illustrate, let's say, nostalgia drag race, they'll use an illustration from 1969.
Right, yeah, they don't use anything from
from the modern era because the cars don't have.
No one's going to show up. What are we doing? But
in essence, so that is what the appeal, why people look at the front engine the Slingshot Dragster,
right,
and say that is just beautiful. And it's like universal. You'll never find anybody who looks at one of those cars and says, nah. You know what I mean?
Right, well, exactly. But we need to, because we only have a limited amount of time.
We do.
Let's take it back to the beginning, right? The very beginning of the Slingshot Dragster. Where did it come from? How did it come about?
Well, okay, so the Dragster's origin, there's many different versions of it, but the person credited with the first Dragster, right, is a guy named Dick Kraft.
Okay.
Built a car called the Bug, which you can see in the Garlitz Museum. He's actually got it there.
Okay.
And all it is, it's a Model T Ford, or it's Model A Ford.
It's a 29, I think. So was that Model A? I think that's the Model A.
So all he did was leave the body off. He ran the car without a body, and that was it. That started the trend. People were like, because people were very weight conscious back then. They drilled holes and everything, and so just monkey see, monkey do, and people started leaving their bodies off.
So that was 1950, though. So that would have been, the first go at not even technically a Slingshot. It just would have been the first dragster, right?
Right.
So then Mickey Thompson, 59, 58, 59.
Well, the cars went through all sorts of different incarnations in the 50s.
Right.
That's very interesting because that was the what's the word I'm looking for? The age of like great experimentation.
Right. Evolution of the advanced and quick evolution.
Well, there was no hard, fast science, so people tried anything they could.
For sure.
You had front engine cars, rear engine cars, you had sidewinders, you had longer cars, shorter cars, you had,
wider. Yeah, I've seen them all. I like the one that I always picture from the first generation of, if you want to call them that, Slingshot Dragsters, like the glass slipper, right?
Right, Cortopassi was the name? Ed Cortopassi?
I have no idea what the name was. I just know the glass slipper it was a enclosed cockpit.
Yeah.
Right? And the car almost has a, I don't know, like a sprint car feel to it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then from there is when you really start seeing the evolution, like, because that was only a span of maybe a year or two between the glass slipper to where they're, bikini body cars, with the
The Dragmaster style.
Right, traditional Slingshot Dragster.
Right. So, but the Slingshot, and Mickey Thompson was the first person to drop the driver behind the rear axle, which kind of makes sense, because
Right.
now the driver is like a bob weight,
Okay.
right? And if you ever mess around with a front engine dragster with the engine out, you just go to the roll cage, you push down on the roll cage, and the front end just comes up in the air.
Right.
I had a '67 Woody Gilmore Flexi Flyer, and it was like that. With the motor out, you could just come with one hand and push down on the top of the roll cage, and the front end would come up like that.
Oh, wow. Serious weight transfer.
Serious weight transfer. Too much weight transfer, actually, which is one of the problems with those cars. They were designed, as the cars, as you went through that era, from 60, let's say 64 was about the birth of the Slingshot, not the birth of it, but the final form of the Slingshot that we know, from 64 to 71.
So it'd have been like the third generation of the dragster would have started around 64 then.
Yeah, well, like I said, you're talking about Slingshot Dragsters. That's really what you're talking about.
Right.
Cars from that 64 through 71 era.
Okay.
So if you look at them every year, they got a little bit longer. Every year, the motor got a little bit lower, and every year the driver got a little bit higher.
Okay.
Like for instance, when the cars first started evolving in 64, 65, 66, there was still a lot of what they called legs under cars, where when the driver was sitting on the car, the axle was actually above his legs.
Oh, and the housing was like directly in
housing was
like man
right
bits.
here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but he would sit with very low, right?
Right.
By 66, 67, that was gone. The drivers were all over the axle.
The pump,
So you
okay.
sat more or less like this with the axle here and the steering wheel here. Okay. And then by the time you got to the last of the cars, 1970, 71, you were actually sitting as if you were sitting in a chair with the rear axle kind of underneath you.
Oh, all right.
So, but that's it. Every year they got longer. The motor pitch in the front got lower, and the driver got higher.
Right. Okay.
And the pitch, see on the Slingshot Dragster, the pitch of the engine, the dump, what they call it, is like crucial. It's one of the most important elements of tuning of one of those cars, because what happens is, as the car leaves the starting line, the driver's weight is trying to push back on the top of it, trying to lift the front of the car.
Right.
Okay. Torque reaction is trying to lift the front of the car. The pinion is trying to climb the ring gear. Right.
Right.
Well, by dumping the engine, you're forcing the center of gravity of the car lower. So the harder you accelerate into it, the more it wants to lever down on the front. So you've got the force levering down on the front, but the driver's weight acting as
the bob weight.
Right, and all of that centers.
And then you get the length of the whole front suspension acting as essentially a lever, right?
The rear suspension is the fulcrum.
Okay.
People you'll see a lot.
Well, and for our younger viewers that probably don't know anything, a lot of this came about because people take for granted today traction, the tire compounds that we got.
Well,
that was the big thing back then. The tires were pretty much just recaps, right? And that's what kind of caused the evolution of the whole thing.
Well, the tires went through. See, in that period of time, let's say 64 to 71, so many different elements were happening. Like, for instance, drag strip pavement changed.
Right.
Drag strips had a specialized pavement at that point.
Right.
The tires changed. The compounds of the tires, the size of the tires, the clutches changed.
Well,
you went from just dump the clutch and spin the
smoke,
tires, smoke them, right, to the first slipper clutches,
right,
and then the Crowler glides and the centrifugal clutches, which were the norm by the end. So those cars went through like rapid evolution. If you're a connoisseur of these cars, you can look at them. You can look at an example from each year and see the changes, the evolution of it.
Right. Okay.
So, but by the time 71 had happened and the rear engine car started to take over, which was Garlis didn't invent the rear engine car. It was actually a refinement of what was already out there.
Right. He just kind of perfected it. Right. Isn't that what it was?
Yeah. Well, Bernie Shacker was running. In fact, he won AHRA events, New York National Speedway, with a rear engine car. You
Did Jen Crispin have one, or somebody on the West Coast?
Crispin had a
one?
Sidewinder, but that was early on. You had Dwayne Ong, the pawnbroker. There were several rear engine cars in circulation at that time. It wasn't a new idea. Art Malone had one. It wasn't a new idea. But what happened was with Garlits, they really, okay, so here's the problem with it. Here's the difference between a front engine and rear engine car. Front engine car, you're sitting at the very back of the wheelbase, and you can see all 4 tires.
Oh,
so when the car makes any sort of move at all, the driver can be right on top of that move and keep the car steady.
Okay.
Right? When you put the driver in the middle of the wheelbase, he can't sense what the back of the car is doing.
Right.
Until it's already made a move. So it has to be much more out of line before he can sense it and make a correction. The first rear engine cars used the same steering ratio as the front engine cars.
Okay.
Which would cause the drivers to overcorrect. And that's why rear engine cars developed a reputation for being ill handling.
All right.
Okay? Well,
they were using the same steering boxes then, essentially just like, oh, hey, we're going to build a dragster, rear engine, and we're just going to use everything we got from the front engine car.
Yeah, well, nobody gave any thought to that.
Right, yeah.
But the person who gave thought was Tommy Lemons, T.C. Lemons.
Right.
There was Garlitz's crew chief.
Right, he was this crew chief for 50 years or more.
And it dawned on him, he says, well, you know, maybe if we slow the steering. First they put mirrors on the car.
Okay.
Right, early in '71, the first experiments with the rear engine car, they had mirrors so that Garlits could actually watch the back of the car as it was going down the track. If it was spinning the tires, he could see. You know, if it was out of line, he could see. But then what Lemons did was he just says, well, let's just mess with the steering ratio. Let's slow the steering down a little bit. And that's what they did. And they slowed the steering down, and the tendency for drivers to overcorrect went away.
Okay.
And then they went. And
right. Well, the old front engine dragsters, the tires would, I mean, you could virtually let go of the steering wheel when the thing's going down the track, and it would pretty much track straight. But they had a lot of, what is it, camber? Or caster?
Caster, we have a lot of caster, yeah.
You turn the wheel, and the tires would flop over all the way, right?
Right, well, if you try to back one of those cars up too fast, the wheels will just flop over.
Right.
Because of all of the caster.
And I'm sure that ratio was probably not conducive of small, minute changes, right?
Well, the caster didn't really change so much when they went from the front to the rear engine cars. But one of the fun facts about front engine dragsters, a lot of people don't know, is that nearly all of them, 100% of them, had open rear ends. They didn't have lockers, they didn't have spools, they didn't weld up the spider gears. They just used a regular production car open rear end.
Right.
And people are like, well, how does that work? How did it not spin the tire, right? Well, it had to do with the fact that the engine was solid mounted to the frame, solid mounted to the chassis in close proximity to each other.
Right.
So the engine torques this way from the left up, okay, and the rear end torques this way from the right up. So when you couple those things together, the engine torque lifting on the left part of the chassis is pushing down on the right part of the chassis and would cause the tires to bite evenly.
Oh, okay.
So now what happened was the car could break traction partially going down the track, could partially break traction, and still keep going straight.
Right.
Because both wheels weren't spinning.
Right.
They allowed one wheel to spin and not the other.
And if you had a spool, it'd get out of shape.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. You'd have to pedal it
right.
to get it to come back. But with the wheels independent like that, the driver would just tug on the brake a little bit.
Well, that's funny. If you look around on the internet, you can find some pictures of dragsters doing burnouts, and it'll be one tire blown off
the thing,
and the other one's still big and fat, and like it's sitting there.
Yeah.
So that explains a lot. Well, so we went from essentially 65 to, well, it would be 71, which would be the major era, right? Then you had the Garlits clutch explosion, which was the beginning of the end.
It was a transmission explosion.
Well, yeah, the 2-speed.
Yeah.
Right. But and then from there, I guess 72, you had King and Marshall was the very last front engine dragster
to win a national event.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think John Weeby was the last person to qualify in a national event.
Okay.
With one. And that was with the Donovan in it. That was the first aluminum motor.
Oh, okay. That based off the 392.
Based off the 392.
Okay. Huh. Well, that's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
But you had a nostalgia top fuel dragster yourself, right?
I had one. I built it. I never got to run it.
Okay.
And okay, here's the story with this one. The car was it was a 1967 Woody Gilmore Flexi Flyer. And what happened was, this was back in 1988, 1989. And I had seen where a couple of guys out on the West Coast, Jim Davis and a couple of the fellows, whose names escape me at the moment, they were running these cars. And they weren't even called nostalgia top fuel cars, they were just front engine dragsters.
Old school drag racing.
Right. And I said, that is the coolest thing in the world. I want a part of that.
Well, and you told me about, like, Cole Coots did a whole story about this. This era.
Well, Cole Coots, that was the mid '90s. Cole Coots did a three-parter called. He was writing for Superstock and Drag Illustrated at the same time I was writing for Superstock and Drag Illustrated.
Okay.
This is like in the middle '90s, and I was doing like nitro tune-up stories and stuff like that. And he was doing like road trip stories, and he did a three-parter called "Have Nitro Will Travel," which if you're into this stuff, find a copy. It's online. Hunt for it. You'll find it. Have Nitro Will Travel. So, but anyway, go back to 1989. I says, I want a piece of this. So I picked up a Woody Gilmore Flexi Flyer. And so a Flexi Flyer was this. Gilmore started building these in '66. You know how a dragster has so you have the bottom frame rails and you have the upper frame rails,
right.
And in between you have uprights and diagonals.
Oh, right, for strength.
Well, the Flexi Flyer had none of those. The Flexi Flyer had the front hoop of the roll cage, right? Or the roll cage.
Okay.
The roll cage hoop, and then those frame rails that go straight down. They get to the motor plate, go like this, and they go to the front of the axle. And then the back frame rails joined at your shoulder, went under like this, and they joined at the front axle.
So it was just wobbling in the breeze.
Yeah, you had uprights for the rear end to mount the rear end. And then you had an upright at the back motor plate, but that upright wasn't attached to anything.
Oh,
it just floated on saddles above. Right?
Oh wow!
So that was an experiment. It was a successful experiment. Those cars were very
light. I'm sure.
Not so much light; they were flexible. And he got the idea from this. Gilmore got the idea from this because Keith Black, the Greer Black and Prudhomme car, which owned drag racing for a while, right? There was a deal at one race, I don't remember which race it was, but car wasn't working, they couldn't get the car to bite. And Keith Black grabbed a hacksaw and started cutting uprights out of the car. And then sent Prudhomme back out there to make more passes. And the more uprights he cut out of the car, the more of the bracing he cut out of the car, the faster it went.
Oh wow!
So Gilmore was like, "Fine, we don't need any of that stuff.
We don't need any of it."
Right. So he built a bunch of these things, and some of them were sold out of a dealership in New York called B&O Auto in the Bronx, and the one that I had belonged to a team called the Jimmy Messenger and not the Dead End Kids, the Brewmaster.
The
Brewmaster. So it went from them to a couple of bracket racers, and it ended up on my hands. So
isn't there like the Brewmaster? Who was the driver?
Jimmy Messenger.
Okay, and I think you told me about him.
Well, the legend is, yeah, and I don't know if this is true or not, but the legend is that he was an adventurous sort, and this was like the late '60s.
Right. Oh, okay.
And he used to like to drop acid and drive these cars.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know what kind of trip you're looking for, right? Because these things, they're surreal as it is,
I'm sure. Right? So you're making two trips at the same time, back and front.
So whether it's true or not, I don't know, but that's the legend. So at any rate, I got this car. It was beautiful. Right? And it was like a jewel, this piece of jewelry. And I put together a blown fuel 392. And just at the point where I was getting ready to run the car, we had everything good to go.
Right.
That year was the first year that the AHRA started instituting the chassis tags.
Oh, for the nostalgia cars?
Right. Now all of my, for anything.
Oh.
Chassis certification, that was the first year for it. The foil stickers and all.
Right.
Well, the spec that my car would have to pass was 10-1B, which was the fuel funny car spec.
Okay.
Right? But they because dragsters were, front engine dragsters, there weren't a lot of them, so they didn't have their own specification yet, so they had to fit the funny car specification.
Okay, because that's the only thing that was front engine still,
Right.
running on fuel.
Mine wouldn't go, and the only tracks I had in my area were NHRA tracks. So there was no way to even take this car.
Wah, wah.
Right, exactly. No way to even take it for test and tune. Unless I wanted to carve the whole thing up and...
You just take it right down to the Bronx and light that sucker off right downtown,
This
right?
is what I'm saying, right? So that was the end of that. And then I got rid of that car. I built a fuel altered for myself, and I started messing around with. I had my hands on a lot of Slingshot Dragsters during that period of time, the middle 1990s and all.
My dad brought one home like in the 70s, and it was an old Dragmaster chassis. We got a big block Chevy together, was going to put it in there, and you had the frame up, and there's literally cracks everywhere. It was all broken, booger welded. And he just like, I'm going to get rid of this, you know, and go with something different.
I went, we on my channel, Uncle Tony's Garage, we went to see a friend of mine. He calls himself the Hot Rod Hoarder.
Okay.
And he's got a collection of these contraptions from that early 60s, late 50s, early 60s era. And these things are made out of, they're welded together out of black pipe and it's just...
Almost a tinker toy, right?
Oh, God, yeah. But yeah, listen, this is a topic, literally, okay? I can sit and talk about this all day. I mean, I could go for months talking about these cars.
Well, we don't have months, though.
We don't have months.
All right, so we'll wrap this up.
Let's do that.
And so make sure you visit Tony at Uncle Tony's Garage. He's got, hit our YouTube, subscribe, like his channel. Go to their, UncleTony'sGarage.com, buy some merch.
Yeah, AHRA online.
Yes.
.com.
Yeah, and you can get a membership or buy some merch and support the organization. And
you can win a trophy?
You can win a trophy. Ultimately, you buy a membership and you can win a trophy after you win some races. But
and if you join the AHRA now, Dallas will actually come and defrost your refrigerator.
I will. Yep. So before I defrost your refrigerator, we'll see you next time for the next episode.
Okay, what are we going to talk about next?
I don't know. I'm thinking fire burnouts.
All right, that works.
Okay.
All right. See you guys later.
See you later.